Europe during the early 1900s was a land of tension. Nationalism, imperial rivalries, the buildup of huge armies and navies, and a complicated web of alliances helped make Europe a powder keg waiting for a match. That match was lit when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Serbia in 1914.
From a pistol shot at Sarajevo, the first of the great modern world wars exploded. And almost overnight, all of Europe was engulfed in conflict. Once the great armies had met head-on, the conflict resolved itself into a desperate struggle to hold this plot of ground, this foot of earth. Military analysts called it positional warfare. But the foot soldiers knew it only as a war of trenches, a desperate fight for a waterlogged hold.
The war pitted the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire against the Allied powers of Russia, France, and Britain. The United States tried to stay out of the war. President Woodrow Wilson issued a proclamation of strict and impartial neutrality. Although the United States would not fight the war, the American people began to take sides. The common language and culture shared with Britain, combined with increasing stories of Germany's brutal actions in Belgium, made most Americans favor the Allies. American industries sent supplies to the countries at war across the Atlantic. Although some U.S. companies supplied the Central Powers, most sold their ammunition, equipment, and other war supplies to the Allies. Soon the Germans began attacking shipments from America using a lethal underwater weapon, submarines or U-boats. In 1915, a U-boat sank the British passenger ship Lusitania, which was also transporting ammunition from New York to Britain. 124 Americans on board lost their lives.
The Lusitania, America's ship of fate. As passengers line the rails, they are getting their last look at land and at life. No hint of the panic that is to come 6 days later here. No suggestion of trepidation, no feeling of disaster. But then, off the coast of Ireland, the first German torpedo struck. Germany's flagrant violation of international law burst below decks. The warning had its tragic aftermath. Germany was inviting us to war.
Americans were outraged by the attack. Fearing American entry into the war, Germany halted the U-boat attacks. But 2 years later, desperate to win a victory, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. On February 24, 1917, the British intercepted a telegram from Arthur Zimmermann, Germany's foreign minister, to the government of Mexico. In it, Zimmermann promised American lands to Mexico if it attacked the United States. The British gave a copy of the message to American officials. When it was published, American anger over Zimmermann's telegram and the resumed attacks on U.S. merchant ships exploded into war fever. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson sent Congress a declaration of war, which the House and Senate quickly approved. After nearly 3 years of neutrality, American troops set off to join the war.
The worldwide economic collapse of the 1930s led to the formation of a number of anti-democratic governments in Europe and Asia. Fascism took its most evil form in Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler became the leader of Germany, and he soon gained absolute control over the lives of the country's people. Hitler believed that the Germans were a genetically superior race that should rule over all inferior races, particularly Jews. Hitler wanted to control other lands, and he prepared his army for war. Beginning in 1936, he took steps to fulfill his territorial ambitions. Germany soon gained control of Austria and Czechoslovakia. Poland was Hitler's next target. France and Britain vowed to come to Poland's aid if it was invaded. But on September 1st, 1939, Nazi troops moved across the Polish frontier. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. By 1940, Hitler's forces had not only taken Poland, but also controlled Denmark, Norway, Holland, Luxembourg, and Belgium. Then the Nazis conquered France. Now only Britain opposed Hitler. The Germans began bombing British cities. These raids took tens of thousands of lives, but the British fought back. Hitler called off his planned invasion of Britain. Instead, he looked east, and in 1941, German troops pushed into the Soviet Union. As the Nazis expanded across Europe, Hitler implemented his plan to exterminate Europe's Jews. The Germans built death camps in Poland and transported millions of European Jews to these camps. There, the Nazis killed them in gas chambers. Altogether, they murdered 6 million Jews. This atrocity came to be known as the Holocaust. While Germany took control of Europe, a surprise attack finally drew the United States into the war. On December 7, 1941, Japanese airplanes attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Some 2,400 Americans died in the attack. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Then President Franklin D. Roosevelt joined Britain and the Soviet Union to fight the Nazis in Europe. The first U.S. ground troops landed in North Africa. Fighting alongside the British, they managed to drive the Axis out of Africa. Meanwhile, regrouped Soviet troops started to push back the Germans. By 1944, the Allies had made progress in Europe, but the main task of Britain and the United States lay ahead, invading France. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, more than 155,000 American, British, and Canadian soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy in northern France. Despite losing thousands of soldiers, the Allied invaders were victorious by the end of the day. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. The Allies launched a rapid drive toward Germany. In April 1945, Soviet troops began their assault on Berlin. Hitler committed suicide rather than be captured. And a few weeks later, the German armed forces surrendered to the Allies. The fight against Japan took longer. In 1942, American forces had begun attacking Japanese troops, starting in New Guinea in the southern Pacific and working their way north. By 1945, American troops had neared Japan. American planes dropped bombs on Japanese cities, while military thinkers planned a full-scale invasion of the country. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. More than 130,000 people died within minutes. 3 days later, after the Japanese still refused to give up, another B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki, again causing massive death and destruction. At last, the Japanese government surrendered. World War II was over. It was the bloodiest conflict in human history. More than 60 million people had died. 2/3 of them were civilians. But at great cost, great evil had been defeated.
After World War II, Korea became a divided country, one split along the 38th parallel. The northern half became a communist state supported by the Soviet Union. the government in the southern half received aid from the United States. In 1948, the United Nations called for a national election to unify the two parts. North Korea's leader, Kim Il-sung, refused to cooperate, however. In the south, where elections were held, Syngman Rhee was elected president. Kim Il-sung remained determined to unify North and South Korea under communist rule, however, and he had a much stronger army than South Korea did. Before he could take military action, though, he needed the approval of his chief source of aid, the Soviet Union. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin approved Kim's plan in 1949, but only after Kim had guaranteed he could take over the South before the United States could intervene. On June 25, 1950, Kim unleashed 100,000 troops in a massive attack on South Korea. The North Koreans made quick gains. Just 3 days after the invasion began, they seized Seoul, the South Korean capital. U.S. President Harry Truman pledged American aid to South Korea. In an emergency meeting, the Security Council of the United Nations passed a unanimous resolution. It promised to assist South Korea in repelling the North Koreans. This marked the first time the UN authorized using armed force against an aggressor nation. Truman ordered American troops stationed in Japan to move into South Korea. He based his action on the Security Council vote, though he never asked Congress for a formal declaration of war. 20 other countries also sent troops, medical supplies, and other aid to South Korea. In September 1950, the UN decided to unify all forces fighting for South Korea under a single commander. Since the United States had sent the most troops, an American general was chosen. That man was General Douglas MacArthur. But MacArthur faced some obstacles. The American army was not as strong as it had been in World War II, and North Korean troops were an effective fighting force. At first, the North Koreans saw success. They forced the Americans and their allies to retreat to Pusan in the southeast corner of South Korea. There, the Americans and their allies held the line. The fighting continued at Pusan for nearly a month and a half, with neither side backing down. MacArthur looked for a breakthrough to end the stalemate. Boldly, MacArthur decided to launch a surprise attack at the port city of Incheon, near Seoul. MacArthur knew the enemy would never expect him to attack there. The currents and tides at Incheon made it a very difficult landing site. MacArthur's plan was to cut off North Korea's supply lines and retake Seoul. U.S. Marines landed at Incheon on September 15, 1950. The surprise attack met little resistance. From that toehold, the Americans began to drive the North Koreans back toward the 38th parallel that divided the two Koreas. 2 weeks later, MacArthur returned Seoul to South Korean President Syngman Rhee. The American success brought new challenges, though. Mao Zedong, the communist leader of China, warned the Americans and their allies not to cross into North Korea. MacArthur believed that China would not get involved in the war. He convinced Truman to let him cross the dividing line. The Allied forces advanced into the north, chasing the Communist army to an area near the Yalu River, on North Korea's border with China. But Mao felt China's safety was threatened by the advancing UN armies. He ordered his troops to attack. On November 25, 1950, 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River into North Korea and attacked the Allied forces. Outnumbered 10-1, freezing and poorly equipped, the Allied soldiers were forced to retreat. The Chinese quickly drove them back below the 38th parallel again. Spurred by his troops' success, Mao decided to take the offensive and rid Korea of the non-communist government in the south. South Korean refugees fled as Mao's army crossed the 38th parallel. Soon after, Seoul fell into communist hands once again. General MacArthur wanted to bring the war into China. He even suggested using atomic bombs against the Chinese. Truman feared that using those weapons would bring the Soviet Union into the war. He turned down MacArthur's request. Meanwhile, the American troops in Korea were reinforced with more ammunition, food, and clothing. The troops were soon ready to begin pushing north again. Mao had unwisely moved his troops too far and too fast. Now he had exhausted men and unwilling, untrained reinforcements. In addition, his artillery was no match for that of the Americans. The Chinese began giving ground as the Americans and their allies advanced. Back in Washington, President Truman wanted a limited war. He hoped to force the North Koreans and Chinese into a standoff that would lead to peace talks. MacArthur urged an all-out effort aimed at total victory. He wrote a letter attacking Truman's policies. When that letter became public, the furious president removed MacArthur from command. By the spring of 1951, U.S. and UN troops had reached the 38th parallel. The fighting became a stalemate, with neither side able to dislodge the other. Peace talks began, but the sides disagreed on issues like the return of prisoners, and no agreement could be reached. The stalemate continued into the following year, a presidential election year in the United States. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had guaranteed he would end the war, won that election. When Eisenhower took office early in 1953, the peace talks seemed likely to fail, but a new development helped break the logjam. Soon after Eisenhower took office, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin died. The men who replaced him decided that the war was too costly and had to end. They began to push North Korea and China to accept an agreement. On July 27, 1953, a ceasefire was finally signed, ending the fighting. That ceasefire is still in effect. No winner emerged from the Korean War. North and South Korea remain divided. More than 50 years after the war, American troops are still stationed in South Korea. But the United States did achieve what it had set out to do. North Korea was never able to turn South Korea into a communist country. The Korean War had a lasting effect on the United States, too. President Truman had set a precedent by ordering troops into battle without a formal declaration of war. His example was followed by several other presidents who came after him.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
As John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency in 1961, he inherited an all-or-nothing defense policy. It provided only two military options for dealing with the Soviet threat: do nothing and let the diplomats work it out, or launch an all-out nuclear attack against the communist bloc. Humiliation or Holocaust? President Kennedy demanded more options, a middle ground. A new defense policy emerged known as flexible response. It called for a massive buildup in conventional forces, as well as new tactical and strategic nuclear arms. It also emphasized counterinsurgency and other unconventional military operations for dealing with threats in the Third World. With this diverse arsenal, the president and his advisors believed it would be possible to fight a limited war with the Soviets, even a limited nuclear war, without igniting a world-ending apocalypse. This premise was tested by the major Cold War crises of the early 1960s. Kennedy encountered his first international challenge after just 3 months in office. Just 90 miles from the beaches of Florida, a military dictator had seized power in Cuba. Fidel Castro promised his people,
not communism or Marxism, but representative democracy, social justice, and a well-planned economy.
But U.S. leaders feared the worst. Castro looked like a communist and talked like a communist. He was a liability. In April 1961, plans were set in motion for an armed invasion of Cuba. The covert mission took its name from the main landing ground on the Bay of Pigs. The CIA had armed and trained a band of Cuban exiles for the covert operation. President Kennedy approved the plan, but then he crippled the operation by refusing air and naval support. The invasion force was crushed. The Kennedy administration humiliated. Attorney General Robert Kennedy feared that the Soviet Union would seize on the Bay of Pigs as a sign of weakness. He warned his brother, if we don't want Russia to set up missile bases in Cuba, we had better decide now what we are willing to do to stop it. Following the Bay of Pigs, the U.S. imposed economic sanctions on Cuba. Castro appealed to the Soviet Union for aid. For Khrushchev, it was a coup, a communist outpost in America's own backyard. What could be better? Khrushchev's elation sprouted into a germ of an idea. What if we threw a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants? In the summer of 1962, Khrushchev's hedgehog triggered the gravest confrontation of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet ships crossed the Atlantic bound for Cuba. They carried military hardware, Soviet troops, and nuclear missiles, capable of striking nearly anywhere in the United States. On October 14th, U-2 reconnaissance flights over Cuba confirmed what for months had been rumored.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons be turned back.
For Americans, the idea of going to war with the Soviet Union was terrifying, but having nuclear missiles stationed permanently in Cuba was unthinkable.
I'd hate like heck to see us go to war, but if it's necessary to prevent a nuclear war, I think the action has to be taken at this time.
Well, I think it's high time we stopped Russia from having things their own way.
I know that some action should be taken, but he's going to have to tread very lightly short of war.
At the United Nations, U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson confronted his Soviet counterpart.
All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation. Yes or no? I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply. I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over. Is that your decision?
The crisis turned critical. U.S. military forces prepared for a possible invasion of Cuba. It was the greatest emergency troop mobilization since World War II. For the first time in its history, the nation's nuclear army, the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, moved to Defense Condition 2. The next step, DEFCON 1, would mean nuclear war. If a nuclear strike was launched from Cuba, American Minuteman missiles were poised to destroy every major city in the Soviet Union. Just as the flexible response had promised, the president had every military option at his disposal. As tension mounted, the first opening in the crisis came from Khrushchev. On October 26th, he cabled the president.
Mr. Kennedy, you and I are like two men pulling on a rope with a knot in the middle. The harder we pull, the tighter the knot, until even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it. Let us relax forces, take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this.
As the two leaders fumbled to untie the knot, events they had unleashed threatened to overwhelm them. Castro pleaded with Khrushchev to launch a preemptive nuclear strike should the U.S. mount an invasion. In Washington, Kennedy was pressed to attack Cuba. Air Force General Curtis LeMay insisted American military forces should surround the island and, if need be, fry it. While the world edged closer to the nuclear abyss, Bobby Kennedy met secretly with the Soviet ambassador in Washington to seek a negotiated settlement. In the end, diplomacy prevailed. On October 28th, a message was broadcast from Moscow. Khrushchev had agreed to remove the missiles. The world breathed a sigh of relief.
The following is the text of President Kennedy's statement of noon. I welcome Chairman Khrushchev's statesmanlike decision to stop building bases in Cuba, dismantling offensive weapons, returning them to the Soviet Union under UN verification. This is an important and constructive contribution to peace.
In exchange for the removal of Cuban missiles, President Kennedy pledged that the U.S. would not invade Cuba. Privately, he also agreed to remove American missiles stationed in Turkey and targeting the Soviet Union. The missile crisis caused the president to reconsider his assumption that a nuclear war was winnable. He now understood that destroying the Soviet Union would mean sacrificing the United States to the same fate. This premise became the basis of a new Kennedy defense strategy: mutual assured destruction, MAD. The idea was that if no one stood a chance of surviving a nuclear war, no one would start one. None failed as catastrophically as American attempts at nation-building in Vietnam. Vietnam and its neighbors in Southeast Asia were colonized by the French in the 19th century. French Indochina, as it was known, was the crown jewel in France's vast empire until the beginning of World War II, when Japan invaded the region and seized control of Vietnam. When the war ended in 1945, France sought to reclaim its colony. They were opposed by a communist organization called the Viet Minh. Their leader was a Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh. Ho dreamed of uniting his country under one independent government. France fought the Viet Minh for 8 years in the First Indochina War before suffering a devastating defeat in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. French forces withdrew from Vietnam, while Ho's popularity spread throughout the country. But Vietnam became a pawn in the emerging Cold War. During ceasefire negotiations, the country was divided. Ho and his communist government would rule North Vietnam. A new Western-backed government was created in the South. American leaders feared that all of Vietnam would turn communist. They pushed aside the French and supported South Vietnamese Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem. Vietnam itself was not strategically important to the U.S., but American leaders feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in the region would follow. This became known as the domino principle.
Finally, you have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up and you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is certainly that it'll go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influence.
The tragedy that followed was epic in its scope and senselessness. Billions of dollars and more than 50,000 American lives were spent to stop the dominoes from falling. In the process, the United States laid waste to much of the country and killed more than 3 million people. But the justification for war in Vietnam was fatally flawed. Ho was a communist, but he was not a puppet of Moscow, as the U.S. feared. His resistance was based on a fierce patriotism that inspired his people to fight on, even in the face of almost inconceivable losses. With the benefit of military support from the Soviet Union and Communist China, they frustrated the U.S. for 2 decades. Finally, in 1975, a tired and demoralized United States abandoned the war. The last Americans were evacuated from South Vietnam, and communist forces overran the capital city of Saigon.
But these events, tragic as they are, portend neither the end of the world nor of America's leadership in the world.
In the end, the dominoes didn't fall. But the communist victory did influence the Cold War. In the 1970s, the United States endured a crisis of self-confidence that came to be known as the Vietnam Syndrome. Americans lost faith in their government. Political leaders lost faith in their military. The country questioned its role in foreign affairs. No one had any taste for another Vietnam. This view contributed to an easing of international relations during the decade known as détente. In the Soviet Union, the effects of the Vietnam War were even more far-reaching. Emboldened by the communist victory and America's ambivalence toward foreign affairs, Kremlin leaders spent lavishly to build their arsenals and extend their communist empire around the world. It was, in effect, a brazen attempt to overtake the United States and win the Cold War. It would be, however, their greatest mistake.
In late 1979 and 1980, the Iranian hostage crisis cast a shadow over all other events on the American scene. More than 50 Americans were held hostage by Islamic revolutionaries who violently objected to American influence and power in their country. In March of 1979, a popular revolution led by Islamic holy leaders had toppled the Shah of Iran, a wealthy dictator whom the CIA had helped to install in the 1950s under President Eisenhower. The Shah promoted Western values and Western capitalism, and despite his dismal record on human rights, the United States continued to support him. In the geopolitical strategy of the Cold War, Iran had been a key ally in the Middle East.
We continue to hold the government of Iran responsible for the safety and for the early release of the American hostages who have been held so long.
As the months passed, public opinion of President Jimmy Carter declined.
I am very angry that the president of our country would do something so stupid.
It was my decision.
For many Americans, the long ordeal was a reflection of the loss of American power after the Vietnam War.
Sorry to miss Christmas again, a second anniversary that we have spent apart.
The hostages had spent more than a year in captivity when Carter finally succeeded in negotiating their freedom.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will...
But the release came too late to rescue him from defeat by the Republican candidate, Ronald Reagan, in the presidential election of 1980. The first plane carrying the freed hostages lifted off from the airport in Iran a scant half hour after Reagan was inaugurated.
The planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free.
Saddam Hussein called this the mother of all battles. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the Persian Gulf War.
Should military action be required, this will not be another Vietnam. This will not be a protracted, drawn-out war.
Relations between the United States and Iraq were strained for years due to Iraq's alliance with the Soviet Union during the Cold War and their stance on other world conflicts. Despite this, the U.S. helped Iraq in the war against Iran during the 1980s. While this battle helped build Iraq into an important power, it also left the country broke. In addition, Iraq's economy suffered because of low oil prices they blamed on overproduction by Kuwait. In July 1990, Saddam Hussein's regime threatened military action should they continue. Saddam also hoped to erase the debt his country owed Kuwait after the Iran-Iraq War. He wished to expand Iraq's presence in the Middle East by controlling Kuwait's huge oil reserves and by annexing the whole country. Due to the region's history, he already considered Kuwait as part of Iraq. The neighboring countries failed to find a compromise, so Iraq launched a surprise invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990. Saddam claimed victory within a couple of days. Meanwhile, the United Nations hoped for a quick and diplomatic end to this occupation. Iraq refused a UN request to withdraw, so the country was put under a total trade embargo. At this point, the United States under George H.W. Bush worried that by invading Kuwait, Iraq had gained easier access to neighboring Saudi Arabia and its vast oil reserves. The U.S. hoped to contain Iraqi influence and prevent Saddam's regime from controlling the majority of the world's oil. On August 7th, the U.S. and a coalition of Western allies deployed troops to Saudi Arabia in a mission called Operation Desert Shield. This military action was based on an earlier plan created by the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Central Command, General Norman Schwarzkopf, otherwise known as Stormin' Norman. In November, the UN gave Iraq a deadline of January 15th to withdraw from Kuwait, otherwise the coalition would be permitted to respond with force. Until January, the U.S.-led coalition presence in the region grew to include soldiers from 34 countries, including Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, and Egypt. This group was led by Schwarzkopf. On January 16, 1991, when Saddam's military remained in Kuwait, Operation Desert Storm began.
5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
Coalition forces had a significant technological lead over their opponents, so this aerial offensive saw the demolition of Iraq's air support as well as much of its infrastructure and important buildings. Iraq responded tactically by attacking Israel with Scud missiles. Saddam assumed he could cripple the coalition with this move because Israel had a policy of retaliation. He knew that Arab nations in the coalition would never fight alongside Israel, and so if he was able to bring them into the fray, he would also be forcing those various Arab countries to leave the coalition. However, President Bush convinced Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir not to respond. Iraq continued its missile attack, while the coalition initiated the war's ground phase in an attempt to liberate Kuwait. Operation Desert Saber saw coalition forces move from Saudi Arabia to Kuwait and finally to Iraq. Though the ground forces of both sides were seen as relatively equal, the Iraqi stronghold collapsed within a few days. On February 28, 1991, President Bush announced the end of hostilities.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met.
Iraq agreed to acknowledge Kuwait as a distinct nation and to rid itself of weapons of mass destruction. However, Iraq failed to fully cooperate with those directives. This eventually led to the invasion of Iraq by the United States under George W. Bush in 2003 and the ensuing Iraq War. 1991's relatively short Gulf War resulted in significant Iraqi civilian and military deaths and fewer than 400 coalition military casualties. However, as many as 250,000 of the almost 700,000 coalition soldiers who served developed an illness called Gulf War Syndrome, purportedly due to the use of chemical weapons. This was one of the first wars to be covered live by television media. Because of this and its impact on world history, the significance of the Gulf War resonated well into the 21st century.
September 11, 2001 marked the worst attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. On that day, 2 hijacked commercial airliners struck the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. Moments later, a 3rd hijacked plane hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And a 4th hijacked plane, apparently aimed at another Washington target, crashed in a field in Pennsylvania.
It was more than you could take in. I mean, it was just total destruction, like as far as you could see.
More than 3,000 people lost their lives in the disaster. As Americans struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of the attacks over the following weeks and months, President George W. Bush announced a war on terrorism. His administration worked on plans to make the United States more secure by finding and punishing the terrorists responsible for the attacks.
I want justice. There's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, "Wanted, dead or alive."
Nobody claimed responsibility for the attacks, but it was quickly determined that Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda terrorist network were behind them. Bin Laden had been planning the attack for years from his stronghold in the mountains of Afghanistan. Bin Laden's hatred of the United States stemmed from several causes. He objected that American troops were stationed in Saudi Arabia, home to the most sacred sites of Islam. He was angered by what he saw as American support of Israel in its dispute with the Palestinians, who are also Muslim. Finally, Islamic extremists, like bin Laden, believe that globalization has led to the westernization of their culture. Islamic extremists first targeted the United States in 1993. In February of that year, a bomb exploded in the underground garage of one of the Twin Towers. Only 5 people died, but the attack was an ominous foreshadowing of 9/11. Meanwhile, Osama bin Laden built up the terrorist group Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden was bent on ending American involvement in the Middle East. On August 7, 1998, Al-Qaeda set off car bombs at the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The blasts killed 225 people and injured more than 5,000 others. And in 2000, 17 American sailors were killed when Al-Qaeda suicide bombers exploded a bomb near the USS Cole, an American warship harbored in Yemen. But the September 11th attacks were the most extensive and the most shocking. Terrorism prevention became a priority. Osama bin Laden quickly became a focus in the war on terrorism. He was hiding in Afghanistan. There, a group of Islamic fundamentalists called the Taliban led the government and had allowed Al-Qaeda to run training camps for terrorists. President Bush demanded that the Taliban turn over bin Laden and shut down the training camps. When the Taliban refused, the United States, joined by Great Britain and other allies, sent in forces. Troops entered Afghanistan with 2 missions. One was to destroy the Al-Qaeda fighters hiding there. The other was to remove the Taliban government from power. The American troops, joined by Afghan rebels opposed to the Taliban, succeeded in bringing down the regime within 3 months, and Al-Qaeda was driven from its sanctuary. American troops killed or captured several Al-Qaeda leaders, but the most wanted terrorist, bin Laden himself, was still on the loose.
He thinks he can run and he thinks he can hide, but he's not going to be able to. So we'll get him. May happen tomorrow, may happen a month, may happen a year from now, but we'll get him.
Still, bin Laden and al-Qaeda remained active.
If you look at the picture, since 9/11, we have seen more attacks in more parts of the world than ever before.
And bin Laden continued to issue video and audio taped messages threatening Western countries and taunting those who had been unable to capture him. The United States has also taken steps to fight terrorism at home. Soon after September 11th, Bush called for the creation of a new cabinet-level Department of Homeland Security to coordinate domestic security. Congress passed the Patriot Act, which gave law enforcement officials broader power to monitor suspected terrorists and detain or deport people associated with terrorist groups. Critics said that the Patriot Act violated civil liberties, but supporters answered that the broader powers were vital to the effort to make Americans secure. In his State of the Union address of 2004, President Bush attempted to reassure the nation that progress was being made in the war on terror.
We're tracking al-Qaeda around the world, and nearly 2/3 of their known leaders have now been captured or killed.
Many of these terrorists, including some of the masterminds of 9/11, have been captured. Hundreds of al-Qaeda foot soldiers are being held at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Despite these successes, some say the danger of terrorism has spread.
One can think of al-Qaeda as a hornet's nest, and we stuck our hand in that nest, and they became active, angry, and left the nest.
We've made it harder to communicate, harder to operate, but they still have command and control because we still see terrorist attacks every several weeks on a big level somewhere in the world.
Aware that danger still exists, armed forces overseas and security forces at home continue to protect Americans by seeking out terrorists and increasing security measures. Next, Bush turned his attention to Iraq. In 2001, the United States accused that country's dictator Saddam Hussein of stockpiling weapons of mass destruction. The Security Council of the United Nations ordered Iraq to allow inspectors to search for these weapons. The inspectors found nothing, though Iraq's government often blocked their efforts. On March 19, 2003, American and British military forces invaded Iraq in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Some argued that weapons inspectors should have been allowed to continue their search, but President Bush and others insisted that it was time to remove Saddam from power. Saddam's forces collapsed quickly, and as the Iraqi capital Baghdad fell, Saddam and other Iraqi leaders went into hiding. In December of 2003, Saddam was captured by American forces.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Despite Saddam's downfall, fighting in Iraq intensified. Terrorists joined the fight, attacking American soldiers, Iraqi security forces, and innocent Iraqi civilians. Critics warned that the United States had entered a quagmire in Iraq, and that the war there undermined efforts to fight terrorism.
Once the administration decided to go after Saddam, key military and intelligence assets were then moved to focus on the hunt for Saddam and building the capability to invade Iraq. As a result, the effort that we had focused on bin Laden and his followers certainly suffered.